It happened on the third day after the cremation. The weather had turned unexpectedly warm for the season, and the sunlight outside her house felt wrong, too cheerful, like the world had missed the memo that something had been lost. I hadn't planned on going inside, but when she opened the door and stepped back without a word, I crossed the threshold as if pulled in by something older than choice. Her house smelled like dry flowers and extinguished fire, like ashes had settled not just in the urn but in the walls themselves. I remember stepping over the threshold and immediately sensing it, that the grief here wasn't quiet or tucked away. It sat in the corners like a presence with its own breath. The urn stood on a low dresser in the living room, placed on a folded square of black velvet. It was silver with a faint ornamental etching near the base, and so still it seemed to absorb the sound in the room. She didn't introduce it, didn't explain. She walked past me and sank onto the couch, legs folded beneath her, her expression not vacant but blank, like someone who had seen too much and now refused to see more. I stood for a long moment, unable to sit, unable to speak, unable to decide what kind of visitor I was. The silence was heavy, but not suffocating, more like a blanket I didn't know how to lift. I stepped closer to the dresser. My fingers itched to touch the urn, not out of morbid curiosity, but because it was the only thing in the room that seemed to hold any energy at all. I wondered what part of him was inside, his hands that once held hers, his mouth that had spoken final words, or simply dust without identity. I thought of my own losses, my own memories. I thought of the coldness that creeps in when someone you loved is turned into weightless fragments. I reached out, hesitated, then let my fingers brush the smooth metal. It was warm, not from life, but from the sun that had touched it through the window earlier in the day. I moved closer. My reflection was distorted in the curve of the surface, and I saw myself not as I am, but as something softer, lonelier, more exposed. The silence behind me deepened. I didn't turn around. I leaned down slowly and pressed my lips to the top of the urn. The kiss was not premeditated. It was not performative. It wasn't for her. It wasn't even for him. It was for the thing between them that still lingered in the air, a thread not yet severed. My lips felt dry against the cool metal. I didn't close my eyes. I just let the contact happen, let my breath fog the surface, let my skin remember the shape of sorrow. I expected nothing from it, no comfort, no release, only presence, only acknowledgement of what had been and what still pulsed in the air like a ghost too stubborn to leave. The moment stretched, but didn't break. I pulled back slowly, letting my fingers remain on the urn for another beat. Her breath behind me caught just once, the sound so small I might have imagined it, but I didn't. I knew what that sound meant. I had made it myself, on other days in other rooms, when someone had done for me what I couldn't do for myself, when someone had looked at the thing I couldn't look at and touched it with reverence. I finally turned to face her. She was sitting upright now, hands gripping her knees, eyes fixed on me with something I couldn't name. Not gratitude, not shock, something more like release. Her mouth trembled at the corners. Her eyes were wide, but not frightened. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it had shifted around us, like the furniture had taken one collective breath and was now waiting to see what would happen next. She stood without a word. The distance between us closed in a single fluid motion. There was no urgency in her steps, no drama, just gravity. Her body moved as if it had always known where it needed to go. When she reached me, her hand brushed mine, soft, barely there, but electric. I didn't flinch. I let the warmth of her palms settle against the back of my wrist, grounding me. My heartbeat is in my ears now, loud and strange, like it had been waiting its whole life for this kind of silence to bloom around it. Her face was so close, I could see the fine lines beneath her eyes, the kind grief doesn't erase but deepens. She didn't smile. Neither did I. We didn't need to. There was no joy in that moment, no triumph, only surrender. Her breath touched my cheek before her lips did, and when they finally met mine, it felt like a bridge being built across a chasm I hadn't known was still open inside me. Her kiss wasn't soft. It was deliberate, full of weight and salt and history. There was pain in it, but also hunger. Not for sex, not yet, but for the collision of skin that could remind both of us that we were still alive. I responded without thinking, letting my lips move with hers, letting my hands rise slowly to her waist. Her body pressed into mine, and I felt the curve of her hip, the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath stuttered against my mouth. The urn was still behind me, cool and still and watching. She leaned harder into me, her hands finding my back, her nails grazing my spine through the thin fabric of my blouse. Her thigh nudged between mine, parting them just enough to make my body shiver. My mind screamed that this was too fast, too raw, too strange, but my body answered differently. It welcomed her, welcomed the weight of shared grief, welcomed the rhythm of someone else trying to anchor themselves in me. We stumbled back into the couch, and she climbed onto my lap, her fingers threading into my hair, her lips now tracing a path along my jaw, down my neck. I tilted my head back, exposing my throat to her breath. I could feel the pressure of her knees on either side of my hips, the way her chest rose and fell against mine. My hands slid up her back, finding the place where her ribs flared out, and I held her like she might disappear again. But she didn't. She stayed. Her mouth returned to mine, slower now, but no less intense. She kissed like someone who needed to prove something, to herself, to the ashes behind us, to the ache between her legs. And I let her. I let every ounce of her grief pour into me through those kisses, through the weight of her body, through the desperation in her hands. We were not lovers. Not yet. We were ruins, clinging to one another, trying to find shape again in the collapse. And as the sun lowered beyond the window, casting long shadows over the urn, over the couch, over the sweat starting to form between us, I knew something had shifted. Not healed, not fixed, but moved, tilted. A door cracked open. And I didn't know yet whether I had just walked into something sacred or something that would eventually burn me from the inside out. We didn't talk about what happened. Not the next day, not the one after that. Our weekly support group resumed as usual. Folding chairs in a damp basement, overhead lights humming faintly, people shifting uncomfortably as they took turns confessing their grief in cautious fragments. She sat across the room from me now, not beside me like she used to. She wore a dark gray sweater that hung too long in the sleeves, her eyes fixed on a water stain on the wall behind the group leader's head. I spoke when it was my turn, but I don't remember what I said. I watched her instead, watched how still she was, how her fingers knotted together in her lap like she was holding herself in place. I felt something sharp in my chest. Not quite guilt and not quite shame, something closer to confusion. Like I had reached out to catch something falling and ended up holding something too alive, too burning, too unfamiliar. Outside the church, she waited by the edge of the parking lot. We didn't exchange words. She fell into step beside me as I walked, and we took the long way around the block. Leaves crunched beneath our shoes. The air was dry and cool, carrying that quiet hum of late autumn. I kept my hands in my pockets, unsure if I wanted to reach for her or if the thought alone would be too much. Her presence was no longer casual. It clung to the edges of my thoughts like static, buzzing just beneath the surface. The next time she came to my house, it was raining. She arrived soaked through, her hair plastered to her forehead, the hem of her jeans dark with water. She didn't shake off the cold at the door, just stepped inside and kicked off her shoes, peeling the wet sweater over her head. Her tank top clung to her body, outlining the shape of her ribs, the curve of her breasts. I handed her a towel and watched as she rubbed the dampness from her hair, water dripping down her arms. There was no apology in her movements, no attempt to fill the silence with small talk. She knew why she was here, even if neither of us had spoken it aloud. We ended up in the living room. She curled up on the couch, legs folded beneath her, the towel draped over her shoulders. I sat across from her in the armchair, trying not to look too long at the way her shirt had slipped down one side, exposing the smooth line of her collarbone. The air felt too thick, heavy with things unspoken. I wanted to reach across the room, touch her knee, ask her what we were doing, but I didn't. Instead, I stood up and went to the kitchen, boiled water, made tea, hands trembling just enough to spill a few drops onto the counter. When I returned, she was staring at the space where the urn had been. I had moved it. I didn't know why. She accepted the mug without a word. Her fingers brushed mine, and the contact shot through me like heat, like a reminder. We sat there, sipping in silence, and I felt the shape of her body in my memory, the way her breath had caught against my mouth, the way she had pressed her weight into me like she was trying to leave a mark. And maybe she had. Maybe that's why everything felt slightly off now, like the seams of the world had been pulled too tight and were threatening to split. That night, when she got up to leave, I walked her to the door. She stood there for a long moment, her hand on the knob, not turning it. I could see her reflection in the window, soft, uncertain, distant. Then she opened the door and stepped into the rain without looking back. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room too quiet, the sheets too cold. My body ached, but not from longing, something else. An awareness, a slow burn beneath the skin, not desire exactly, but the aftermath of it. I turned onto my side, then my back, then finally gave up and walked barefoot into the kitchen. The teacups still sat on the table, empty but unwashed, like the night hadn't finished with them. I stood there for a while, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. The next morning, I found her hairband on the floor beside the couch. I picked it up carefully, like it might break. It smelled faintly of her shampoo, something citrusy, clean, sharp. I held it in my palm, then tucked it into the drawer in my bedroom without thinking. I told myself I'd give it back next time I saw her, but I didn't. I kept it there like a secret. The days blurred. We continued to meet at the group, sitting with bodies angled away from each other, never mentioning what had passed between us. The others noticed, I think. One of the women glanced between us during a session, her brow furrowed slightly, her lips tight. I felt seen in a way I didn't want to be, like my skin had been turned inside out. I started avoiding mirrors. My reflection unsettled me. I no longer recognized the woman staring back. She looked the same streaks of gray in her hair, same creases at the corners of her mouth, but her eyes were different. They held something restless, something raw. Then she came again, not late this time, not uninvited, just appeared at my door as the sun was going down. She wore a long coat and no makeup. Her face looked softer in the twilight, almost gentle. I let her in without a word. She stepped past me, walked into the kitchen, and opened the fridge like she used to. She poured herself a glass of water, drank half, then turned and leaned against the counter. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. I stood across from her, unsure what this was. She placed the glass down, came toward me, and reached for my hand. I let her. Her fingers threaded through mine like it was nothing, like it had always been this way. We stood like that for a while. No words, just breath and body and the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Later, in the bedroom, she undressed slowly. Not like before, not frantic or hungry. This time, it was careful. She folded each piece of clothing as she removed it, placed them neatly on the chair, then sat on the edge of the bed. I watched her from the doorway, pulse stuttering. Her body in the low light looked almost unreal. Skin pale and smooth, the faint outline of ribs, the subtle dip between her thighs. She didn't look at me, just reached out a hand. I went to her. Our bodies met like fabric slipping across fabric. Quiet, fluid, inevitable. I kissed her shoulder, her jaw, the inside of her wrist. She let out a breath, long and slow, and leaned back, pulling me with her. I laid beside her, not on top of her, and traced her hip with my fingers. She shivered, but didn't flinch. My mouth found her nipple, soft and already hardened, and I circled it with my tongue until her hand tightened in my hair. She moved against me then, pressed her thigh between mine. I felt the heat of her, the dampness, the tension. I slid my hand down her stomach, slow, reverent, until my fingers parted her and she gasped. She was open, so open, and I touched her with care, with memory, with something dangerously close to tenderness. She buried her face in my neck, and I felt the wetness of tears I didn't question. I kept touching her, kept holding her, until she broke apart in my arms, silent and trembling. Afterward, she turned away from me and curled into herself. I stayed awake beside her, watching the curve of her back rise and fall. I reached out, hovered my hand above her skin, then pulled it back. Something in me had shifted again, something small but final. The thread between us had frayed. And somewhere inside, I felt the first real tug, the sense that something was beginning to tear, not violently, but slowly, quietly, like the slow unraveling of an old seam. He started speaking to me in the middle of the night. At first, it was only fragments, half-formed sentences that clung to the edge of sleep like condensation on glass. I would wake up with a pressure in my chest, a memory of a voice I had never heard, but somehow recognized. It wasn't terrifying. It wasn't even strange. It was expected, as if something had finally slipped through the cracks we had opened between us, carried in on her breath, passed from her mouth to mine like a seed left behind in the soil of my body. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom or command. It murmured. It sighed. It asked questions I didn't know how to answer. It knew things I hadn't said aloud. It whispered my name, not with intimacy, but with observation, like it was trying to place me. I would lie still in the dark, heart hammering, breath caught, as though moving would solidify it too much, make it real in a way I wasn't prepared to admit. Some nights it came just as I was drifting off, soft syllables brushing against the inside of my skull, curling around the parts of me that still hadn't made peace with what we had done. Other nights it woke me like a current, strong, undeniable, rising from someplace deep and unwelcome. She didn't know. Or maybe she did and chose not to say anything. Her body remained close to mine, sometimes in the bed, sometimes across the room. Her presence had shifted. She moved differently now, with less warmth and more purpose, like she was carrying something too fragile to drop, but too heavy to share. Her silence pressed against me harder than any of her touches ever had. I watched her in the mornings, how she stood by the window with her coffee, how she stared at nothing. I stopped asking questions. I just watched. The voice became clearer. It began saying her name, Not lovingly, not possessively, just calling it out, as if trying to find her. Sometimes it would say mine, soft, unsure, curious. Sometimes it didn't speak in words at all, but came as a sensation, a pulse in my throat, a tightening in my gut, a heat in my palms. I couldn't tell if it was memory or manifestation. All I knew was that it lived inside me now, not her, him. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into distractions, cleaned the house obsessively, rearranged bookshelves, took long walks through neighborhoods that didn't feel like mine. But no matter how far I walked, it followed. It hummed beneath music, behind the hiss of the shower, under the turning pages of a book I couldn't finish. I stopped sleeping through the night. I started dreaming of water, dark and slow, rising around my ankles, then knees, then chest. And always, always, I heard him in the distance, calling out from beneath the surface. The night it changed, she was asleep beside me, her hand loosely draped across my stomach. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I could feel him in the room. Not just his voice now, but a presence, weightless, cold, magnetic. The air had shifted, my skin tingled. I didn't move. His voice slid into my mind like a thread pulled tight. He said one word. Mine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But something in me clenched. Not in fear, in recognition. I sat up slowly, peeling back the blanket. Her hand fell away from me. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. I stood barefoot on the cold floor, the hardwood pressing sharp against my soles. I walked to the dresser, opened the bottom drawer. Tucked beneath scarves and forgotten sweaters was the urn. I had hidden it there weeks ago, unable to bear its presence, unwilling to part with it. I pulled it out and placed it on the floor in front of me. The metal was cool, dull, impassive. I knelt, folded my legs beneath me, and placed my hands on either side of it. My heart pounded. My mouth was dry. The room felt thinner, like the air had been sucked out slowly. He spoke again, this time louder, not with words, but with feeling, regret, hunger, recognition, possession. It hit me in the chest like a wave. I bent forward, my forehead resting against the cold surface of the urn. My breath fogged the metal. I felt tears rise, uncalled, and fall soundlessly down my cheeks. I didn't understand what was happening, but I didn't resist it. I let the grief move through me. Not just mine, not just hers, but his. I became the vessel, the seam between them, the crack where memory leaked through. Later that week, I found her in the living room, sitting on the rug with his wedding band around her thumb. She didn't look up when I entered. Her eyes were fixed on the ring, her fingers slowly turning it. I watched from the hallway, unseen, unmoving. I wondered how long she had been sitting there like that. Hours, maybe all day. I didn't speak. I turned and went back to the bedroom. That night, I dreamed I was inside her house, but everything was reversed. The furniture was upside down. The clocks ran backward. Photographs bled their ink down the walls. He was there, not in body, in sensation. He moved behind me, around me, through me, and I felt myself reach out, not to push him away, but to hold him, to let him in. Not because I wanted to, but because he already was. When I woke, her head was on my chest. Her breath was warm against my skin. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling and listened to her breath, to the quiet, and to the voice that was no longer separate from my own. It had fused. It had settled. I carried him now in the deepest places. And part of me, ashamed and startled, began to wonder if she knew. If that's why she clung to me in the dark, if that's why her body sought mine so feverishly, so mindlessly, not because she loved me, not even because she needed me, but because I had become something she recognized, something that still, somehow, smelled like him. She began to wear his clothes. It started with a flannel shirt, oversized and soft from years of washing, hanging off her frame like a borrowed memory. Then came the boots, heavy and scuffed, soles worn down in places I never thought to examine. She wore them without irony, without explanation. She didn't smile when I noticed, didn't offer a reason. She just stood in my kitchen one morning with his belt looped through her jeans, his leather jacket hanging from her shoulders, her hair tied back in a way that made her jawline sharper, her gaze unfamiliar. I said nothing. I poured coffee, handed her a cup, and kept my eyes down. My hands trembled slightly when our fingers touched. I told myself it was from the heat of the mug. The house felt different now, thicker, as if the air had learned to hold more than oxygen, grief, memory, heat, breath. I found myself walking slower, speaking less, afraid to disturb whatever unspoken arrangement we had stepped into. She moved through the space with a quiet confidence, leaving traces behind her like scent trails. Cigarette smoke on the porch, long blonde hairs on the pillow, water still dripping from the shower hours after she'd used it. Her presence didn't just fill the house, it consumed it, and I let it. One night, I returned from the store to find her in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor in one of his old t-shirts, the urn open beside her. The lid sat neatly on a folded cloth. Her hands were dusted faintly with ash, her fingers resting on the rim. She didn't look at me when I entered. I stood in the doorway, the grocery bags slowly growing heavier in my arms, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. She reached into the urn with both hands, cupped a small amount of ash, and lifted it to her face. Her eyes were closed. She inhaled through her nose like she was trying to memorize the smell. I placed the bag on the counter, carefully, quietly, and left the room without saying a word. After that, she began sleeping in his clothes. She'd crawl into bed in his sweatpants, his thermal shirt, sometimes even his cologne clinging to the fabric like something recently dead. I could smell it on her neck when she leaned against me. I could taste it on her skin. The scent was wrong on her, too sharp, too dry, but somehow it pulled something loose inside me. I didn't know what it was, only that I didn't stop her. She began to touch me differently, less tender, less searching. Her hands grew firmer, more decisive. She would push my shoulders down into the mattress, press her mouth against mine with a hunger that felt directed at something behind me or through me. I felt like a vessel again, not a woman, not even a body, just a passage, a way forward or a way back. Once, during one of those nights, she rolled me onto my stomach, straddled me, and whispered something against the nape of my neck. Not words, not language, but a low sound, guttural and hollow. Her hands gripped my ribs tightly, holding me in place, her breath hot against my spine. She moved on top of me slowly, as though trying to remember the rhythm of a song she'd once danced to. I could hear the creak of the mattress, the slap of flesh, the rasp of her breath turning into something almost masculine. I closed my eyes and saw his face. Another time, she brought something home with her, a box wrapped in old newspaper. She placed it on my bed and peeled away the paper with care, revealing a glass jar filled with some dark, viscous substance. I didn't ask what it was. She dipped her fingers into it, then touched my chest, smearing a line above my breastbone, then another across my stomach. The substance smelled metallic, almost sweet, like blood warmed by candlelight. Her eyes never left mine as she climbed on top of me, her mouth finding the place she had marked, her tongue slow, deliberate. I felt like I was being marked for something, claimed, sacrificed. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to wash the sheets. Our rituals deepened. We stopped speaking during sex. We stopped turning on the lights. I started leaving the urn in our bedroom, on the nightstand, then on the floor beside the bed. Sometimes she would rest her hand on it as she lay beside me, fingers tapping against the metal like she was listening for an answer. I began dreaming of fire, not destructive, but purifying. Flames curling up the walls, licking the ceiling, and her body standing in the center of it, untouched, glowing from within. I lost track of time. Days folded into nights, into days again. I stopped going out. I stopped answering calls. My world had shrunk to the boundaries of this house, her skin, and the ashes that followed her like perfume. I would wake to find her already dressed in his clothes, sitting on the floor, talking softly to something I couldn't see. Her voice was low, steady, reverent. I never interrupted. One morning, she stood over me as I woke, wearing nothing but his funeral suit jacket. Her legs were bare, her hands tucked into the sleeves. She looked at me with a gaze I couldn't place, not affection, not desire, something else. She climbed onto the bed and straddled me, her knees pressing into my hips. She leaned forward, her hair falling like a curtain around my face, and placed her mouth on mine. The kiss was deep, slow, and tasted of salt and something older. When she pulled away, she whispered a name. It wasn't mine. That night, we didn't sleep. We stayed curled together on the rug in the living room, the urn between us, candles lit along the walls. Her fingers traced patterns on my thigh, shapes I couldn't interpret. My body felt like it belonged to her, like it had been borrowed, repurposed, hollowed out for something beyond pleasure or intimacy. I didn't resist. I let her enter me again, fingers first, then her mouth, then her body moving in a rhythm that had nothing to do with lust. It was grief transformed, hunger redirected, a ritual born of longing and the failure of death to separate what love had fused. I no longer knew what part of her I was touching when I held her, or the ghost inside her, or maybe both. She fell asleep with her face against my chest, the urn nestled against her side like a child. I stared at the ceiling and imagined my own skin turning to ash, flaking away piece by piece until nothing remained but bone and breath and the memory of touch. I wondered what she would do with me if I were to vanish, if she would keep me in a jar, speak to me in the dark, press her mouth to my memory as she had with him. The thought didn't scare me, it comforted me. She stopped calling it my house. At first, it was subtle, the way she moved through rooms without hesitation, the way she rearranged the cabinets without asking, the way her shoes began to multiply by the door like roots spreading in soil. But then came the language. She would say things like, "I'll light the candle in our room," or "Let's open the curtains in our kitchen." Our. Not mine, not even hers. Ours. And I let it happen. I didn't fight the shift. Somewhere along the way, the walls had bent inward around her, and the structure had changed. The place where I once lived alone had become something else entirely. Not a home, a shrine. The walls began to absorb her. She hung his coat on the back of the chair he never sat in here. She nailed his watch above the bed like a talisman. She brought in photos I'd never seen, black and white images from years ago, grainy and soft, showing his profile in dim lighting, half smiling like a secret only she was ever allowed to know. She propped one up on the nightstand and lit a tea candle in front of it every night before we got in bed. The flame flickered against the glass, casting his face in motion. I began to feel watched, even when she wasn't in the room. One afternoon, I came home to find the living room transformed. The furniture had been pushed aside. A large white sheet covered the floor. On top of it were bones, real bones, not plastic, not decorative. They were pale and yellowed, scattered in no order I could understand. Some small, some long, some clearly animal. She knelt in the center, her hands covered in chalk dust, drawing circles around them, muttering under her breath in a rhythm I didn't recognize. I stood frozen in the doorway. She looked up at me only once, then returned to her work as if my presence didn't require acknowledgement. The smell of decay lingered after that, faint but constant, buried beneath layers of incense and wax. I opened windows, I washed blankets, but it stayed, clinging to corners, to fabric, to my skin. I could taste it sometimes when I licked my lips, coppery, earthy, old. She didn't seem to notice, or she welcomed it. The bed became a place of silence. We still touched, still pressed skin to skin in the dark, but there was no softness now. Her hands moved with purpose, her mouth searching not for pleasure, but for something else, something buried. She would whisper his name into my throat as she kissed me, and I stopped correcting her. My body didn't resist. It folded, bent, allowed. I began to wake with bruises, faint at first, along my hips, my collarbone, the inside of my thighs. I didn't remember pain, only weight, pressure, a presence that was not entirely hers. I would run my fingers over them in the shower, watching the color bloom beneath my skin, and feel both invaded and claimed. The bruises began to feel like language, like someone was trying to write a message on me from the inside out. The group sessions became impossible. I stopped attending. I couldn't bear the smell of folding chairs, the hum of fluorescent lights, the polite nodding of strangers trying to swallow grief in tidy bites. I stayed home while she went alone, returning with that wild, buzzing energy that clung to her shoulders like electricity. She would come in, eyes glassy, cheeks flushed, and I would know something had followed her back. I would feel it when she undressed, when she slid her hands beneath my shirt, when she pressed her mouth to mine with that urgency that bordered on something feral. She began to speak to the bones. Late at night, I would wake to hear her in the living room, murmuring, laughing softly, cooing like someone rocking an infant. I never went to her. I listened. The sound of her voice no longer belonged to her alone. It had changed in pitch, in cadence. Sometimes it deepened, carried an echo I couldn't explain. One night, I heard two voices, hers and something underneath it, something lower. I pressed my hands to my ears and held my breath until silence returned. I found the bone arrangement still laid out days later. This time, the pattern had shifted. The bones formed a rough outline of a human figure, curled into a fetal position. My necklace was placed at what would have been the chest, my hairbrush lying beside the skull. It looked too deliberate to be accidental. I didn't touch it. I didn't ask questions. I stepped around it carefully and went upstairs. She stopped sleeping in the bed. She slept on the floor beside the bones, curled beneath one of his jackets, her face pressed to the floorboards like she was listening for footsteps beneath the house. I left a blanket near her once, but she didn't use it. She seemed to grow thinner, sharper, her movements more rigid, her voice quieter. But her eyes never dimmed. They burned. One morning, I woke to find her standing over me, barefoot, naked, her entire body marked in charcoal lines, symbols, words I didn't understand, spirals and circles, and something that looked like ribs drawn over her actual ones. She reached out and touched my face with one stained finger, then walked away without a word. I lay in bed for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the house had become something more than just a structure, if it had turned into a body, a container for what we could no longer speak aloud. The next time I looked in the mirror, I saw something behind me. Not a person, a shadow, a ripple, something just barely out of sight. I turned, but nothing was there. I began to hear the creaking of floorboards when no one moved. I began to feel the weight of eyes on the back of my neck. I began to taste smoke in my throat. The house no longer felt like mine. It had become something else, a cathedral, a tomb, a cradle of something ancient and restless. And I, whatever I had once been, had become a part of it. Bone, dust, silence. I didn't resist, not anymore. It was the night of the new moon when she set the table. There were no lights on in the house except for the dozens of candles she had scattered along every surface. Tall pillars, tea lights, wax-dripped columns that flickered and danced in the stillness like quiet witnesses. The air was heavy with the scent of burning tallow, resin, and something else. Something almost sweet but wrong in a way I couldn't name. I watched her move in silence as she laid the plates down. Bone-white porcelain edged in faded gold, mismatched but deliberate. The silverware gleamed in the low light, polished to a shine that caught the flame and threw it across the walls in sharp flashes. She had cooked, or created. I didn't know which word belonged anymore. There were bowls filled with dark berries that looked overripe, splitting at the seams. Steamed greens that bled purple onto the linens. Meats I didn't recognize, thinly sliced, raw in the center, glistening under a glaze I couldn't identify. Everything on the table looked lush, abundant, decayed. It smelled like iron and smoke and longing. She wore nothing but his shirt, buttoned halfway, her legs bare, her feet dusty from pacing across the floorboards. Her hair was wild, unbrushed, falling into her face. Her eyes were hollow and alive at the same time. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, not because I wanted to eat, but because something in me understood that this was not a meal. This was a ceremony, a threshold. She took the seat across from me. Between us sat the urn. It rested in a wide wooden bowl lined with dried flowers, small bones, and feathers. A candle burned directly behind it, casting its shape into darkness, a silhouette that loomed larger than life. I couldn't look directly at it without feeling my vision blur. She began the feast without words. She reached out with her fingers, tore a piece of meat from the platter, and placed it directly in her mouth. She chewed slowly, deliberately, eyes never leaving mine. Grease glistened on her lips. She swallowed and picked up a berry, squeezed it between her fingers until the juice ran down her palm, and then licked it clean. I watched, frozen, the candlelight making her movements look otherworldly, like a priestess or something older. I reached for a piece of bread and broke it in half. Steam rose from the center, faint and fragrant. When I brought it to my mouth, it tasted of rosemary and something faintly bitter. My stomach clenched, not in hunger, but in recognition. The food was more than food. It was offering, sacrament, memory, body. We continued eating, slowly, ritually. She fed me from her fingers at one point, pressing a piece of blood fruit against my lips. Her eyes locked onto mine, daring me to reject it. I didn't. The juice ran down my chin, and she leaned forward to lick it off, her tongue warm, firm, unflinching. I felt my pulse rise, but not from arousal, from surrender. Halfway through the meal, she stood and left the room without explanation. I sat in silence, the candlelight pulsing like breath. I could hear her footsteps above me, then the soft creak of a door. When she returned, she carried something bundled in cloth. She placed it gently on the table and unwrapped it. It was a heart, not metaphorical, raw, real, small, maybe animal, maybe not. I couldn't tell. It lay glistening in the center of the cloth, veins still visible, edges slightly curled from drying air. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and then picked it up with both hands. She held it to her chest, pressed it against her skin, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, I nodded. She cut it with a small silver knife, clean and quiet, and placed half on each of our plates. We ate it together in silence. The texture was tough, metallic. The taste lingered on my tongue like morning. After the meal, she rose and walked behind me, her fingers trailing along my shoulders. She leaned down and whispered something into my ear. Not a word, but a sound, low and vibrating. I closed my eyes. I felt her hands on my neck, sliding down my chest, pulling me up from the chair. I let her guide me, my body weightless in her grip. She led me to the center of the room, where the bones had been arranged into a new shape. This time it resembled a bed, or a nest, or a grave. She pushed me down onto it gently, and I lay back, the cold press of bone against my spine sharp and grounding. She straddled me, the shirt opening around her like a curtain. Her skin was marked again, dark lines trailing from collarbone to navel, symbols etched in ash or soot. She moved over me with a reverence that made me tremble. Her hands found my wrists and pinned them to the floor, her eyes searching mine, as if seeking permission from someone who was no longer me. When she entered me with her fingers, I felt not pleasure, but unraveling, as though every part of me that had once held shape was being undone, drawn out, rewound into something new. I cried out, not in ecstasy, but in release. My body shook, my mouth opened. I tasted dust and salt and blood. She kept going, deeper, slower, her breath hitching as if something inside her was breaking loose. She bent forward, her forehead pressed to mine, her hair falling around us like a shroud. We moved as one, a rhythm not learned but remembered, as if our bodies had always known this moment was coming. When I came, it wasn't an orgasm. It was an ending. She collapsed beside me, her hands still on my stomach, fingers twitching. The bones beneath us shifted with our breath. Somewhere nearby, a candle sputtered and went out. We lay in silence for what felt like hours. The house no longer creaked. The air was perfectly still. I felt something settle into me then. Not peace, not love, not closure, but a presence, a weight, a knowing. When I finally rose, the candles had burned low. She was asleep, curled on her side, her hands folded beneath her cheek like a child. The urn still sat on the table, untouched, its shape familiar now. I walked to it, lifted it in both hands, and cradled it against my chest.
I looked around the room at the remnants of the meal, the bones beneath the cloth, the woman asleep in shadow, and I knew this would never be undone. This was the feast at the end of mourning. The grief had been consumed, and I had become part of the dead.